Hello, everyone. So, good afternoon, and welcome to our seminar this afternoon, uh, Political Campaigns and Direct Mail. My name is Andrew Gustin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Sustainable Mail Group. If you don't want to miss any of our future content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and the link in the description below will also provide you with a link to our Sustainable Mail Group sign up. I'm very happy to introduce somebody who we've had an opportunity to work with in the past, and Chris Rougier. Chris is the managing director of MPH, a cause marketing agency located in Toronto. And Chris has a very long history as a political strategist with extensive experience in managing high profile campaigns and mobilizing communities. He's worked with a variety of levels of government in both Canada and internationally, including the Conservative Party of Canada and the Ontario PCs. And Chris is best known for his expertise in crafting cause-driven stories and developing community-led marketing strategies. And if I'm not mistaken, you're a bit of a fiend in curling. Is that right, Chris?
Die-hard curler, big fan. It is my favorite sport.
So if you're okay with this, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. And I think it's timely given all of the stuff that's happening in Canada right now. But let's just kind of dive into this conversation. So I think people's perceptions in general have been that there's been a mass migration towards digital media in terms of how they communicate, how political campaigns communicate with individuals, but that's not really the case. There's still a very significant role for direct mail. So can you maybe talk to the point around how direct mail has evolved, since the onset of digital strategies?
Certainly. First of all, direct mail has some inherent advantages when it comes to political campaigns. Political campaigns are unique in a couple manners. First of all, political candidates are given the name and mailing address of every single voter. So they actually have full mailing address of every single Canadian in their riding or if they're a national party across the country. So that gives them a very large database in the mail space to work from, something you don't have when you're starting out online. You have to build up your database, you have to collect emails, all of that kind of stuff. Secondly, the core action that political campaigns want somebody to do is to vote, which requires going to a polling station that is physically located near their house, which means all of the actions and all of the call to actions, all the things we want them to do is specifically tied to where they live, i.e., the polling station in their neighborhood and their home because of that. So that immediately prioritizes mail as a key marketing channel for political campaigns. Now, since the revolution of digital marketing and social media and all of these things, the two have become integrated together, but they only work when they're integrated because social media, it's very, very good at marketing to an email address. It's very, very good at marketing to an IP. It gets worse and worse at marketing to a specific location the more specific you get. And because of the nature of our electoral system, you have to be very specific about who you're talking to. So that's why they have to work in tandem. You have to be able to collect information online, market to these people through both online channels and through the direct mail world. The other element of it is I think we all know we're all bombarded by online advertising at this point. I think there's some statistics out that show that the average person sees something like not 800 or 900 ads a day or something like that. While more and more of the space has moved away from marketing via mail, this gives us a bigger piece of the mail pie, the bigger piece of that short amount of time somebody's looking at their mail, going through it to actually get our message across. So a well-designed mail piece and a well-timed mail piece can have exponentially more impact than online advertising because we know who we're talking to, we know where they are, we know what we want to say, and we have more percentage of the time available to do it.
So, you talked about the integration of digital and direct mail on this thing. So can you maybe kind of elaborate about that? Like, what are some signs of good campaigns? Like what pieces might end up being better suited in the digital sphere, and how do they end up integrating into a printed piece?
So one of the things is there are sort of three elements to the on the ground campaigning: identifying who people are going to vote for, persuading them to vote for someone possibly, and then getting them out to vote, or GOTV. The reality is that digital marketing is very, very good at the first one and somewhat good at the last one. And the one in the middle one, the persuasion, it has a bit of challenges. So the reality is it has to work in tandem where you're using the efficiency and affordability of online marketing to determine who your accessible voters are by asking them what their name is and what their postal code is. And because you have data matching on the back end, you can then determine a full address for that person. Um, if they're accessible to you or supporting you, you then put them into a persuasion or a GOTV pool where mail kicks in. So you start with the cost-effective online tools, and then as a voter becomes more valuable to you from a likeliness to vote for you perspective, you use the more expensive tools, but the more effective tools of direct mail to persuade them, to engage them, and to pull them out to the polls.
And so, just as, something came to mind actually because through the last provincial campaign, um, like and perhaps I'm singular in this, typically think of um, email, but mobile has started to play a bigger role. I know that I started ending up getting text messages from some of the local party candidates here in Ottawa. How much of a bigger role are things like text messaging playing into that, and how does that integrate into your overall campaign then?
So SMS campaigns are probably about 3, maybe 4 years old here in Canada. And they have, similar to what email did 10, 15 years ago, sort of revolutionized how campaigns are run because it's yet another very cost-effective way to connect with voters. Just like email, though, it requires the two-way communication. You have to reply back and engage, and if you don't, they're sort of marketing to a blank wall and they don't know what to do. The reality is you can expect SMS marketing to continue to grow in the market space. It is less offensive at this point to the voters than email. It is less frustrating and it's easier to push out, particularly multimedia SMS with images or GIFs or links to videos. These types of things have become extremely effective with very, very high click rates and very, very high conversion rates. But at the end of the day, all of these tools are aimed at one thing: figuring out who you are and where you live so we can tell you where to go vote and which candidate to vote for. So all of those things are coming back to that same physical location and determining where to vote. The reality is I think in the US election last fall, something like 1.5 billion text messages were sent on election day. The average American received 75, I think, text messages on election day in the US. So you can probably expect maybe not that intense, but in the next federal election, if you own a mobile device, to be receiving over the course of the campaign dozens of text messages about politics.
And so, can you kind of walk us through maybe about like how a campaign might end up evolving from let's just say from the time the election writ is dropped to the point where the actual election is held. So, and how does that kind of potentially end up migrating through, or if it does, even from digital through direct, or how do they kind of blend into each other?
So, first of all, writs are issued or drawn up. They're never dropped. They're documents, so you
Sorry,
you can't
gotcha.
drop them on the floor. But essentially, because you only in a federal campaign, you have 36 days, and everything has to get done by election day. So it is very much an all at once situation. You can't, unfortunately, like traditional marketing campaigns, wait for a campaign to go out and responses to filter back in, and then engage and then re-engage. You've got to do everything all at once. So plans are built on a scale of election day minus. So the election begins on E-Day minus 36, and it counts down to E-Day itself. The reality is direct mail of various types, whether it be neighborhood mail, the unaddressed variety, or personalized mail, which is addressed. All of those campaigns are almost the largest of those campaigns are initiated immediately. So is the digital, so is the online, so is the SMS, so is the telephone calls. All of those channels begin firing all at once. What changes day by day is the database they're marketing to. And in a sense, it starts with either the entire voter pool or a very large subset of the voter pool, and it starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller, essentially categorizing voters into two groups. Those that will vote for us, so we don't need to bother them again until it's time to vote. Those that might vote for us, so we need to spend the time persuading them. And every other category of voter very quickly gets excluded. Voters parties know nothing about are excluded. Voters that are committed to other parties are excluded. You're not going to market to somebody, if you're working for Coca-Cola, you're not going to market to somebody who explicitly told you they only drink Pepsi. So those people are immediately excluded. Um, and then there's those two groups. There's a couple windows mid-campaign, usually about when the debates are, just before advanced polls. That's when the persuasion stuff begins. And that's when you get into personalized mail, you get into longer mail pieces, you get into personal letters from candidates, you get into persuasion pieces, you get into what we call ballot question pieces, which essentially present before the voter a choice based on a question that you decide. And ideally, you've picked the right question and you're the right answer. But that's the ultimate marketing challenge of elections. And then finally, in the final few days of the campaign, when timelines become so short and so tight, we measure operations in hours, not days. Mail sort of stops at that point, and we move to either in-person communication or phone communication, with the last mail pieces being timed to arrive either the day before election day or 2 days before election day, no later than that, with the final arguments to our supporters, to your candidate supporters, encouraging them to go and vote. The reality is, and so many people find this ridiculous, but we know what our turnout numbers are federally. They're about 55 to 60%. I think it was 62 in the last federal election, and in Ontario, it was in the low 40s this time. So the reality is there's a large chunk of people who are even committed voters, not just non-committed, undecided, don't know, don't cares. Even committed voters who don't make the time to vote, who don't make the plan to vote. So if you can just increase those numbers even slightly, it can swing the election significantly. The reality is we saw that in Ontario, campaigns that had effective ground games, effective volunteers, were able to perform a whole lot better than campaigns that weren't. And this all rolls up to, at the provincial level, one party severely underperforming their vote percentage simply because they weren't able to execute on the ground of actually getting people out to the polls. So mail and digital all come together as sort of almost a melting pot of marketing to deliver all of this. The challenge is very much because you have 36 days and you don't know when it's going to start. You have 36 days to do everything all at once.
So you made some interesting points there that don't seem weren't self-evident for me, which is the fact that, if you have a committed voter for a specific candidate and it happens to be your candidate, you're likely to focus less attention on them than somebody who might end up sitting on the vote. At a really high macro level, does that mean, for instance, in ridings which are, either very, blue, red, or orange, for instance, that may there be, a big effort towards, driving the vote in those areas, and you might focus on areas which may end up swinging one way or another.
So in politics, I used to always say in training, if you're guessing, you're losing. So very much political parties do their best to avoid guessing. We don't we don't target areas. We don't target neighborhoods. We don't target ridings. We target people. We target individuals. We know their first name. We know their middle name. We know their last name. We know their mailing address. We know where they vote. We know any information that we've been able to gather from them over the last 30 years of political databases. And political parties have some of the most extensive, expansive, and oldest databases in marketing. The reality is I can speak for the Conservative Party. Their database first went online in the late 90s. And that data has evolved and been kept and grown leaps and bounds for years since then, and evolved with the trends and evolved with the technology to accommodate all of it. Same with the Liberals, same with the New Democrats. So we avoid, whenever possible, the guesswork of a blue area or a red area, because even a red area 30% of it's still going to be blue. Even a blue area, 20% of it might be red. And if you pull out that 20% red, it could get you in trouble. So the goal of every political campaign is to never guess, to always know exactly who you're targeting and talking to. And this is where direct mail particularly has a significant advantage over every other communications channel.
Do you, I know, one of the questions I wanted to ask was like, the roles around personalization, but some of what you're saying right now makes me, wonder as to, do you ever look at any political information in terms of how the targeting ends up playing into it? So, and this is hypothetical. Um, people who go to hockey games might be more
Mhm.
apt to end up whatever. Is like any of that information ever play into the mix?
100%. Well, gathering that information is much more challenging in Canada than it is in the United States. It's very easy to do in the United States to go to list brokers and be able to develop personas, targeted audiences, and be able to categorize individual voters into various archetypes. It's harder to do in Canada, but it can be done. And we know that there is a correlation between particular activities, particular demographics, particular actions, and political activity. Very much, for example, a very good example of this, and this one's a bit dated, it no longer applies, but when I first got involved in politics, the number one indicator of a likelihood to be open to voting conservative was home ownership. If you owned a home, you had a higher likelihood of voting conservative. So now that has changed with modern times and changing demographics and changing communities and changing issues. Today, that's a very different set of people that would have a high propensity to vote conservative. But that was one a very long time ago. So we would be regularly collecting data on neighborhood home ownership rates, neighborhood education rates, neighborhood, even what news they watch, what TV shows they watch, what community sports and after work activities they participate in, how many kids they have, how many grandkids they have, depending on the neighborhood, what languages are spoken at home. You pick a particular demographic. These organizations are collecting them and either applying them or trying to infer them to neighborhoods to get a better picture of who lives there, to have a better understanding of how to communicate with them. We know, and all marketers know this, that if you can communicate with somebody on their level, whether that's in their language, with their type of imagery, with stuff they connect to, they're more likely to connect to your brand. It's the exact same with politics. And so they are taking the same sweet spot demographic data and trying to figure out what theirs is and market to it.
So, you're bringing up some interesting points here is that, like, there's that element of personalization that comes out of the core voter list that you may end up getting, but now you've collected all of this other information. Does that information personalize the messaging that somebody might end up getting either in a digital piece
Mhm.
or in a printed piece? So two individuals who may end up being ultimately targets of a particular political campaign may have different triggers. Is it possible for you to provide that level of targeting in the messaging?
Yes, and it's not even necessarily different political campaigns. The same political campaign might be sending different people different messages based on what we know about them. Not changing their platform or what they're promising, but how they're delivering it and how they're presenting that argument. The reality is you could be a conservative voter and so could your neighbor, yet you two could be getting two very different messages from the Conservative Party. If if the political campaigns are doing their job right, the message changes drastically, almost person to person at this point. The reality is I think the biggest matrix I ever had resulted in about 75,000 different possible combinations of product going out. And so the message may change neighbor to neighbor, but if you're doing this really well, it doesn't change for the same individual. So it doesn't matter if they're getting a text message through SMS, an email in their inbox, a card in the mail, or even a knock at their door. They're getting the same message from all of those different channels. And then their neighbor is getting a different message, but again, the same via all the channels. That is the sign of a very well run campaign of creating message consistency with their target voters across all channels. But it changes channel to channel in the sense that you can be a lot more creative with direct mail because you have the capability of print and imagery, and you can use image to tell a story. You can use a product to tell a story. What Not just what the card looks like or what the letter looks like, but how it's constructed can help tell that story. While in a text message, you have to use different words in a different process because they're consuming the information differently.
That's actually really interesting. It's really good. So, like, we've had a campaign here in Ontario recently. We're about to end up getting into one very shortly, I anticipate. Um, do you have any recent examples where there's been really successful campaigns that have ended up using direct mail? Something that, kind of may stand out from other examples, possibly.
So one of the most interesting campaigns is one we helped out with as a vendor, and they were successful. Was the Conservative campaign in Algoma, Manitoulin, in Northern Ontario. We ran some very creative direct mail projects for them in this past election, and they knew it was going to be close. They also knew a lot about their voters in that they had to build a connection between their candidate and the voter. It wasn't just, here's what we're promising, take it or leave it, vote for it or not. They needed to, it's a very rural riding, it's a northern riding. People need to feel like they know their MPP. So they built a highly personalized letter that we helped produce that was distributed to their riding in a fairly small quantity, but the reality is that our distribution was larger than the eventual margin of victory. So we know that letter had a significant impact on the margin. And being able to build a high quality, high impact, we call it a high value persuasion piece, to help support them was a lot of fun. And I'm very confident it was a significant impact on the election result on election day because it was able to make that connection with voters.
So let me just kind of take this to a greater field of view. You've had an opportunity to work outside of Canada. Um, in quite a number of different countries, in fact, if I'm not mistaken. Um, are there are obviously some rules around data that come into play differently in different jurisdictions. But, are there any campaigns outside of Canada that, you felt were, successful and unique in terms and could possibly end up being adapted to the Canadian market, or if they
So
haven't already? Yeah, sorry.
The UK has some very good examples of this. I campaigned with the Conservative Party there for a few years, and they successfully have taken their database to a level where they have or had. Again, times have changed, voter attitudes have changed, and this is constantly evolution. But at the time, they had 11 million identified voters, not an archetype, not a persona. 11 million individuals they knew by name and home address, who they knew these 11 million people would swing the election. Thanks to years of research and data collection and whatnot, they knew these 11 million people were likely to be the swing voters in the next election. They then spent 3 years running a marketing campaign across every channel to those 11 million people specifically. And the reality was, because they were so accurate in knowing who they were, they had pulled most over the top advertising and marketing off for those people. They would not target them with blanket online ads. They would not target them with television. They would not target them with newspaper or billboard advertising. They only targeted them with email if they had it and direct mail, which they definitely did have. And they spent 3 years targeting those individuals to persuade them. And then in the end result was a surprise election the other way, against polling, because those 11 million people had gotten 3 years of marketing material from the Conservative cause. The reality is that type of effort takes numerous things, some of which you can't do in other countries. Like, a lot of the data they had would not be available here in Canada for voters. They had 150, I think, demographic points on these individuals. I think in Canada, as high as you can get is about 11.
Sorry, what do you,
So
what do you mean by that?
What kind of car do they own? How many kids are in the home? What kind of wine do they like? What kind of soft drink do they drink? All of those are individual data points, and that information in the UK, the United States, and other countries is commercially available for purchase by list brokers and data vendors. That's not available in Canada. Getting that information at a specific individual level is either completely impossible or almost impossible in Canada. So running that level of campaign is harder here, but still can be done with the right time, the right planning, the right effort. But those types of things, I've also seen direct mail campaigns in Australia that the barrage, almost to a weekly scheduled mail piece that voters came to expect their piece from the right wing party is the Liberal Party, from their weekly piece from the Liberals and what it was going to say, to the point that it would make news. So they were getting earned media simply from sending out a mail piece. Um, and so there are these opportunities that can create and generate side effects for the campaign. But the reality is, at the end of the day, it is about identifying who that potential supporter is, making sure they're a supporter that will support you, and then getting them out to the polls. And that last stage is where mail also comes in, because it's then used to drive them, to encourage them, to remind them of the value and the importance of voting. But all of that comes together into one campaign.
So, the next question is kind of like, more a point of interest for me than it is necessarily relevant to the Canadian market. But like, do things work differently for like first past the post elections, like we end up holding, for instance, in Canada, versus, a proportional representation campaign where you may not necessarily be voting for a specific campaign, or you may have a representative, or you may have kind of a mixed scenario where you may be voting for a party and you may be voting for
Mhm.
a representative? Like, does that make it more
So
complicated?
so it can, but regardless of the particulars of how you vote, those that are voting are people. They're humans, and humans everywhere. You need to give them a reason to vote for you. You need to persuade them. And I've always said this, that persuasion and cause marketing is significantly more difficult than commercial marketing. Commercial marketing, all we want is their money. Persuasion and cause marketing, we need their heart and mind, and they're much more reluctant to give that away. And even more so, we need their time, which is to go vote. And that's the one thing people just won't part with easily. The reality is whether you're voting in a proportional system like Australia or many European countries, a first past the post system like Canada or the UK, or a congressional system like the United States, the reality is you're still having to do the same thing. You're having to convince these people to give you their time and give you their mind and go to the polls and vote for you. So while there's differences in the mechanics and there's differences in some of the functionality and messaging, we're all still trying to do the same thing, which is to convince a human being to do something they have no interest in doing.
Yeah, I think you may have ended up answering the question, but I'm gonna, kind of, uh, extend this a little bit. We've just gone through a leadership campaign. Um, and I think the difference with that is that, um, in order to be able to vote for that leadership campaign, you have to do, an extra step, which is become a member of a party. You've been involved, in a couple of leadership campaigns. How does the marketing of that work? I mean, is there effort involved in trying to get people into the party, or do they just kind of align themselves normally? And then how do you define them in terms of, which candidate do you want them to vote for?
So our digital marketers will know this. Every time you add a step that you need the user to do, it becomes exponentially less of a chance that they're going to make it to the end. It's why Amazon and all the online websites have buy now, single click buying, because if you have to type in your address, you're going to lose people. If they have to type in their credit card, they're going to lose people. If they have to go to the next screen, they're going to lose people. It's that and worse with leaderships, because it isn't just buying, it's not just becoming a member. You need to buy a membership. You need to confirm, which means you need to put up money, which means you need to put up a credit card, which means there's 3 screens involved in that. Then you need to confirm you have a membership. Then you need to verify your ID by, in the Liberals' case this past week, verifying it through an app supported by Canada Post or a Canada Post outlet, which is a whole other process of making them go to a place to do a thing. Or the Conservative Party, it required you to scan a copy of your ID and print it off and put it in the envelope. And then you need to mark your ballot and put it in a different envelope in the same package and mail it back. There are the average Canadian to vote. We have one of the simplest voting processes in the English speaking world, one of the simplest ballots in the English speaking world. For a Canadian to vote, it truly requires about 4 steps. Go to a polling station, present your ID, mark ballot, put in box, but that's pretty much already done once you've walked into the polling station. You don't even need to register in Canadian elections. You can just show up on election day and vote. To vote in any political party's leadership, you need to buy a membership, verify that membership, verify your identity, get your ballot, fill out your ballot, send back your ballot, whether it's electronically or by mail. There's 5 or 6 much more complicated steps there. So it changes the entire marketing campaign. Usually leaderships are longer than an election, so we have more time to do it. But it starts with just convincing people to like your candidate, and then if they like your candidate, you to buy a membership, which less than 1% of the Canadian population is a member of any political party. So you're immediately taking, I'll use the Conservatives I'll use the Liberals as an example because they're recent. In the last election, they got about 36% of the vote, something like that. So assume 36% of Canadians are open to buying a membership. Less than 1% of them will. The turnout in leadership was, I think, around 40%. So only 40% of that 1% actually cast a vote. And then Mark Carney, didn't really need a leadership. He won in overwhelming, this was a waste of time to level numbers of 85%. But still, only 85% of that 40% of that 1% voted for him. It's leadership campaigns are looking for needles in haystacks and then convincing that needle to stand like on its tip. Like, it's extremely complicated and time consuming. And because our voters are so used to a very simple process of voting in general elections, they get very frustrated very quickly with the complexity of leadership elections, which immediately makes more of them not want to vote.
So can you, sorry, because we're talking about this, can you contrast that maybe with like what the US system ends up looking like with primaries and
Mhm.
ballots, which can be, you know, pretty long?
So yep. The US system, there's advantages and disadvantages to their system. The disadvantage is the complexity of the ballot, most certainly. Another disadvantage is you have to be registered to vote before election day in almost every state. There's very few states that allow same day, I don't think there's any anymore that allow same day registration. So you have to make sure you're on the voters list in advance. That's more complicated and adds more steps. The advantage they have is the frequency. Not only are they voting for Congress every 2 years, but there's state elections in there, municipal elections, judicial elections, local county commission elections. There's so many more elections in the United States that the general voting public is more comfortable with the idea of voting. It's a regular thing. The other element that makes the U.S. a little easier is, regardless of if it's a state, federal, or local election, you're almost always voting in the same place. And while in recent years here, municipalities, provinces, and federal elections Canada have started trying to sync that up, that people vote in the same place, they're a long way away from that. So we're traded off here. Our elections are far apart, 4 years federally, 4 years provincially. And if they're timed right, a Canadian may go 3, even 4 years without voting for something, or knowing they have to vote for something. So we can't create that expectation and that regularity to it. And we also can't create that learned habit of how to do it. It takes a very long time. Well, Americans, at least every 2 years, but sometimes even every year, depending on the jurisdiction they're in, they're voting. So it's a more complicated ballot, but they're seeing it more often. So that makes it a whole lot easier. Their primary process, again, while it's a bit more challenging, it also is an official process. It's a process run by the government and uses the resources of government, as opposed to our leaderships and nominations, which are run by parties and use the resources of the much more smaller, much more limited political parties to operate.
So let's just kind of continue on that leadership perspective, right? Because um, you're if I'm not mistaken, right? Are you using the same data that you would have ended up having from a past election on the leadership side of things, or are they just two different data sets and you cannot play with one versus the other?
Then the twain shall never meet. Leadership campaigns are considered separate legal entities from the political parties they're running for, so they can't use any of the data the political party has collected for its purposes. Under Canadian law, they need to build their own database from scratch. Now, usually they're given a leg up because they are provided with the list of members from the political parties. This is usually done by the federal parties, but that's it. And then they have to go out and, over the leadership, build their own brand new database, their own brand new system, and their own brand new assets of data assets to work with. And then also because their candidate may have a very different appeal than the standing audience of the political party they're running for, they've got to build a completely different audience. And usually that is why leadership campaigns, they sort of break into camps very, very quickly of, this represents this element of the party, this represents this element of the party, those types of things. But you have to build that database from scratch. You have to build that list from scratch. You have to get opt-in consents again from almost everyone except for people who've become members of the party. Like it is a long, complicated, expensive process, and every step of the way you lose people. So that is why being efficient and being, more importantly, effective at this, understanding how to persuade, how to engage, how to connect with an individual voter and move them from "I don't know who you are" across the steps to "I know who you are, but I don't care. I know who you are, but I do care and I like you," to "I know who you are, I care, I want you to win, I'm going to vote for you," to the even further next step: not only am I going to vote for you, I'm going to volunteer for you and I'm going to help you win. Each one of those steps is like any funnel there is, where you lose a significant amount of people along the path, and if you do it right, you get more out at the far end and are more likely to win.
So I mean, we in the last Liberal leadership campaign, I don't recall really seeing anything from the candidates outside of social media. And I'm just trying to, think about, um, whether I would have ended up receiving anything in the mail, whether I don't recall seeing anything in email, possibly. Um, how do those, how outside of like the social media side of things, in a leadership campaign, how do you get into, trying to identify who might be there other than, okay, we've had past behavior that has ended up existing, but how do you try to get new people into the pen?
So, particularly this past Liberal leadership race, because it was only 45 days or something like that, I think it was nearly
I was
the
surprised it was even
shortest.
that, right? Wow,
Yeah,
yeah,
it was one of
okay.
the shortest leadership races on record. That immediately takes a significant portion of your marketing capability off the table, because you just don't have the time. The next element is, don't forget, these are fundraising and spending regulated events. So you can only do what you can raise the money for, and you have to raise it in no more than $1,750 at a time, because that's the maximum donation amount. So in a shorter time, you also have exponentially less money. Finally, again, as I said earlier, I'm sure they did this again, the Liberal Party would provide each of the accredited candidates with a list of probably current Liberal members and recently lapsed Liberal members, and they would provide their phone numbers, emails, maybe some other contact information. But if you aren't a current Liberal member or a recently lapsed Liberal member, how are they going to find you? And because of the shortness of the race, there's more value in focusing on those lapsed ones and getting them to renew and persuading those current ones than there is in trying to do generalized marketing to get people to sign up and opt in. That takes a long time and a lot of money, and that's not something that they had in this race. So I'm willing to bet the growth of the Liberal membership list from the start of the campaign to the end of the campaign was very, very small due to simple time constraints. And this was largely an inside the tent marketing campaign as opposed to trying to bring more people into it.
Okay. So we're very likely going to be going into a federal election. Um, what kind of, advice would you end up giving to, anybody who's, working through this to avoid, specific pitfalls or challenges in their direct mail u- use utilization? Things that they should really avoid, things that they should really do.
This happens to me every election. I will get a phone call usually about 7 days before election day
Whoa.
from a campaign that says, "We have money left. We want to send a mailer." And I just laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. It's not happening. The reality is particularly with direct mail, you need to plan it in advance. Even the best production shops in the country, and I work with all of them, even if they run 3 shifts a day for the campaign, they're going to need, depending on the size of your mailers, a day to produce. And then Canada Post, no matter what, you've got to give them 3 business days to get your letter there. It doesn't matter if it's going to the house next door. Canada Post needs 3 business days to get the letter there. So that means if you want a piece of mail to arrive in a voter's hand on a Friday, you have to put it into the mail at the latest on the Tuesday, preferably the Monday. And that means it needs to go into production on the Friday or the Thursday, usually more than that. It's usually 2 or 3 days production. So let's say the Wednesday before, which means your data and your creative needs to be done the Tuesday before that, which means the shop needs the green light at least the Monday before that. That's 10 business days before you want it in their hand. That's the absolute minimum. Now, I've done it in less, but please don't make me. Please, please, please don't make me. Um, you want to plan your mail advanced out and understand your campaign's 37 days long. Most campaigns have their lawn signs already printed in a garage somewhere. They should be calling their mail vendors now and saying, what is a walk back calendar for a GOTV card landing on this date? And you don't need to say a particular date. You can say that calendar I mentioned earlier, E-3. I need a piece on E to land on E-3. When do we need to start the process? I want a persuasion piece to land on E-12. When do I start the process? What's the budget for that? So that it's all lined up, that all you need to do when you get into the campaign is provide your vendor, your mail provider with the creative and provide them with the target list. And then they can go to work. There's no back and forth on timelines, on all of these other things that can be planned out in advance of the campaign. Also, I will say this, most mail providers who do political work, if you come to them before the election and lock in that you're going to do these 3 or 4 or 5 things with them during the election, they'll give you a little bit of a discount as well because you've just taken a whole lot of headache off of their lives and they can begin planning their schedule and their production schedule well in advance. We can do it, but there's nothing, as you know, a print shop hates more than the manager comes down in the morning and says, all the things we were planning to do today, we're stopping and we're doing this one thing that has to go out tomorrow. They can do it, but you're going to pay for it.
Yeah. So your experience indicates that, virtually, at this stage of the game, for the ones who've got their acts together, everything's been locked and loaded, and it's just a matter of, an announcement to come through, and then we'll start seeing, which is always, surprises me that, that when an election comes, notice comes through, how quickly things progress in terms of, lawn signage seems to appear very, very quickly, emails and, social media campaigns, which may require less physical effort, but nonetheless, but then mail pieces come through really quickly. So you've just kind of reinforced that. Is there anything else
It's a
we're missing
lot.
in the, sorry, go on.
It's a lot of planning, and there's a small, every political party has a very small but very dedicated and very good permanent staff that are in a perpetual campaign, that are constantly planning for the next one. From the day the last one's over, they start planning for the next one. When I worked at the Conservative Party, we had a permanent staff of anywhere between 12 and 20 of us, depending on the likelihood of an election. And the minute the election was called, that staff would balloon to over 240. So we were a system that was built, and you would look at it and go, from a regular business perspective, you're way overbuilt. Why does such a small organization of 20-ish people have all of this capacity, not just in square footage, but in digital capacity and email capacity and all these things? It's because there's no time to ramp up the way a traditional business would. There is a matter of hours between being a staff of 15 and being a staff of 250. And all of that works if you're planning properly. Everyone knows who's going to work where. Everyone knows what job they're going to take. Everyone knows what needs to be done. And this is right through to the local level. The sign crews who put up those signs the day after election day, they're ready to go right now. They know who they are. They know what their crews are. They know what their neighborhoods are. So the minute the election starts, they're going to print off the list of lawn signs and hit the road and get out there. It's going to be the same with mail. Good campaigns already know we're going to have this rack card go out in week 1. We're going to have this persuasion letter go out in week 2. We're going to have this other letter go out in week 3. We're going to have this GOTV piece go out in week 5, whatever their mail tempo is, and then they just begin pushing buttons. That isn't to say it is too late. It is to say it's almost too late. So if there's anyone in politics who hasn't thought about this, you still have time, but not much. And it is worth sitting down and saying, how much of my campaign budget, which is again limited by law, how much of my campaign budget do I need to dedicate towards mail? And please remember that a stamp is, I think, $1.12 now. And personalized mail is over 50 cents a piece. And unaddressed mail is, I think, 16 or 17 cents a piece. And that's just for the postage. So you're going to need to think a little bit about your budget, because most ridings now in Canada are anywhere between, outside of the margins like PEI in the north, ridings in Canada are anywhere between 40,000 and 70,000 households. And so understanding how much budget you need set aside to run that mail campaign is going to be absolutely critical.
Thanks. Um, do you have any other points you want to cover off on? I think we've covered a lot of material and we've gotten really into a lot of very focused detail. I really appreciate your insight.
The reality is, the last thing I'll say is mail pieces are probably some of the most fun political campaigns have. It's where we get to be our most creative. It's where we get to have a significant impact. And if done right, if done like we've done everything from scratch and sniff political pieces to pop-ups and
Okay,
tagged on sticky notes.
I'm really curious about that. What are we sniffing? Okay.
So this was a fundraising piece we did a while ago that was tested because what was looked like, it was a somebody writes a cover fundraising letter that says, I've included this memo from our campaign director who's begging me for funds. Can you please send money right now? And the included memo is a coffee stain sheet with like a coffee stain like stained into the paper, and it smells like coffee because they like spilt it on. And we wanted to see if that would increase the likelihood of donations. So you name it, this is where we've had all kinds of creativity. One campaign, we were talking about prescription drugs, so we shaped a rack card piece like a bottle of pills, and it looked like a prescription on a big bottle of pills that was in the mailbox. This type of stuff is how you get the voters' attention, because they all hit delete on the email, they all scroll past the online ad, they change the channel when it comes on TV, and they glaze out when the YouTube ad is running. But you get 7 seconds when they open their mailbox and see that piece in their mailbox to interact with them and put a thought in their head. And if you do it right through direct mail, it will stick in their head right through to election day.
Well, I mean, I'm going to be paying a lot more attention to the stuff that starts coming through my mailbox as a result of this conversation. And I'm going to be parsing out, the various details that you brought up because, I wouldn't have normally necessarily, seen that level of differentiation, from what my expectations were to what actually comes up. So, Chris, thanks for your time today. I really appreciate this. I know that we kind of put this together very last minute, but the timeliness of it was good, especially given what's going on. And to the people who are watching it, thanks very much for watching it. If you by all means share the video with your colleagues, and stay on top of the content, just click on the subscribe button. Um, and if you feel it's, that there's value in what you're seeing, and that you want to be part of us, please consider joining the Sustainable Mail Group. I'll provide the links for all of those things in the description of the video below, including Chris's contact details, his LinkedIn bio, and a means by which to actually get in touch with his agency. Chris, you do work outside in the political sphere as well. And in fact, if prior to this, you mentioned that you do a lot of other stuff in terms of cause marketing as well. So,
Mhm.
the interest, all of this, isn't just focused in politics. There's an ability to be able to leverage this into other areas. So hopefully people consider that.
We used to build armies for politics. We now build it for not for profits and everyone else. So it's a really rewarding work.
Thanks, Chris. This was fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you.